Deadly Triplets, a Theater Mystery and Journal by Adrienne Kennedy. Part 1, Chapter 1. Last night, John Lennon was murdered at the Dakota apartment in New York City, 4 blocks from where I am now living. I find it a strange and terrible coincidence that several years ago, I started writing a play based on Lennon's nonsense books, In His Own Right, and A Spaniard in the Works, in a studio at the top of the Dakota apartments, and that the writing of that play led to my being involved in a mysterious and brutal death, a murder most unexpected. My theatrical producers, who let me use the studio in the Dakota to write, put me in touch with Lennon's English publisher. The publisher liked the pages of the play I had written. This, and some reasons that I myself was not entirely aware of, reasons that dealt with the strange demise of my adopted mother years ago in England, convinced me that London was the place I wanted to go. I brushed aside the unfulfilled longing and curiosity that I had never satisfied about my adopted mother's illness and last days, and accepted my more obvious reasons. I was recently divorced, in the throes of a new career as an off-Broadway playwright, a career that was bringing me recognition and the onslaught of theater celebrities, and I had just received a large writing grant. I gave up my apartment in Greenwich Village, put my furniture in storage, and took my 2 young sons to England. I wasn't to meet Lennon until many weeks later, but by that time, I was entangled in the deadly ambitions and desires of other people I was yet to meet. I didn't know that my adopted sister, Antonia, whom I hadn't seen since I was 8 years old, would seize my stay in London as the time when she would avenge the wrongs she thought I had done her. The time was spring 1967. It was the time of British movies. Ipcress File, Darling, James Bond, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Jimi Hendrix, Carnaby Street, Miniskirts, Jean Shrimpton, Twiggy. British movie stars Michael Caine, Peter O'Toole, Albert Finney. The Rolling Stones and the Beatles. My boys had all the Beatles records, and often we'd sit in their room and sing, I Want to Hold Your Hand. As soon as I arrived in London, I met with Lennon's publisher. I remember taking the Underground from the Basil Street Hotel in Knightsbridge to Bedford Square. The offices were in a small house. The publisher and I talked in a dim, cluttered office, although outside the spring sun was bright. Miss Sand, you have my permission to show your script of Lennon's books to theatrical producers, he said. He was a middle-aged, dark-haired man in a black suit. Both he and his desk were almost gigantic enough to fill the small office. If something comes of showing the script to theatrical producers, then we can talk about terms. He shook my hand, and out I went into the wonderful April afternoon. Back to the Basil Street Hotel, a small, very charming hotel that seemed hidden away by Harrods. My sons, 7 and 8 years old, were sitting in the lobby talking to an elderly British gentleman in a military uniform who was attending an annual club banquet. The banquet had started in a lovely room beyond the lobby. The boys and I stood in the doorway and watched the men in uniform and the women in elegant formal dresses. The boys were delighted to see me. go see a movie?" they asked. We walked all the way to Leicester Square. We saw Diamonds Are Forever. The next days I spent phoning agencies for a place to live. American Express had provided me with a list of places that were for rent. I also had called several people from the long list of theater people I had compiled from American friends. I had lived in London for 3 years as a child, but had forgotten almost everything about the city, except an image of a long street with some steps that led to a dark house. The house where I had lived with my adopted mother. One of the people I called was a producer at a theater in Hampstead that was always written about in the Village Voice. His name was Charlie Berman. "Suzanne, I'd like to meet you. I saw your play off Broadway when I was in New York. I loved it and would like to produce something of yours while you are in England. You know, I produced Joe Orton's plays." Joe Orton was a writer who had been killed by his lover, and people in the theater still talked about it constantly. Berman and I agreed to meet the next Sunday. "Suzanne, would you like to meet Joan Littlewood?" he asked before he hung up. "Also, John Arden and his wife are friends of mine." And then he asked, "Do you look at all like the picture of you that was in Vogue magazine last winter?" "I think I do." "You must be beautiful then." "Thank you very much, Charlie." I remembered the article in Vogue in People Are Talking About Suzanne Sand, playwright, 28, violet eyes, wavy masses of auburn hair, dark golden skin. She enchants those around her, something she seems unaware of. One wonders, is this the way Ethiopian princesses looked? Her beauty amazes, and amazing too are her poetic gifts exhibited in her short play, The Heart of Alain Delon, presented off-Broadway and now in rehearsal at the Petit Odéon in Paris. She has a love of violet dresses, adores movies, and meeting famous people of which she keeps lists. It was spring, and I was abroad on a Guggenheim grant. In the next days, I found 2 floors of an exquisite house in Primrose Hill on a very pretty street, Shalcott Crescent. On the very day that I signed the lease, I had an interview with the Evening Standard. The Standard did a short piece on me. American writer Huron Grant, enchanted by England and Primrose Hill. They also mentioned my eyes, which do look violet at times, and the fact that I had lived in London briefly as a child when my adopted parents moved here from New York. It wasn't until a year later that I was to discover that this article in the Standard played a crucial part in shattering events that were to follow, and that I would regret that I had spoken about my life in the newspaper. The article in the Standard also briefly summarized The Heart of Alain Delon, mentioning that it was to be presented soon in Paris at the Petit Odéon, the theater headed by Jean-Louis Barrault and his wife Madeleine Renaud. The Heart of Alain Delon has as its heroine a young woman who possesses such intense dream waves that they reach the French actor by whom she is obsessed on the set of Purple Noon, where he is working. She remains by his side on the set of Purple Noon a film about a young murdered American whose identity is taken. Underlying these events are the powerful elements of mixed identity, desperation, and death. Victor Hamilton of the Royal Court is very interested in producing the play at the court's soon-to-be-opened experimental theater upstairs at the court. Chapter 2. Chalcott Crescent was beautiful. We lived on 2 floors of the house at number 37. It was furnished and belonged to an English family who was in Nigeria. The faded parlor faced a wild garden with a brick wall. The boys had a large sunny room on the lower level. My room, the master bedroom, was the prettiest, shuttered and decorated in dark rose. All the houses on the curved crescent were painted white with Regency fronts. Our door was a lovely yellow. My sons were thrilled because the television series The Avengers was filmed on the crescent. The exterior of the corner house was used for the Avengers to emerge from and pursue their enemies. We all loved our house, but we were afraid of the spiders in the bathrooms, which were off the garden. We were happy. The following week, I met Alex Haley, visiting London to do research about his African ancestors, David Mercer, who wrote the screenplay for Morgan, and Kenneth Tynan, who had written such brilliant reviews for The New Yorker, who now had a post at the National Theater as dramaturg. I worked on my list of famous people. And in June, I wrote in my diary with the violet flowers on the cover. I met James Eyre, star of The Aristocrat, at the party in Little Venice given by the Bohèmes, friends of my American producer. He invited me to lunch next Wednesday. I'm so excited and enchanted. James Eyre and I had lunch in a restaurant on Beauchamp Place. He invited me to come to the Royal Court Theater and see him in a play called Deadly Triplets. Being with him filled me with delirium. While we were having lunch, he went to make a phone call. Everyone in the restaurant stared at him. He was dazzling, tall, graceful, golden hair, extraordinary blue eyes. The Aristocrat had been one of the most admired movies of the last 2 years and had won a British Oscar. Now, Suzanne, I want to hear everything you've been doing since you've been in London. Being a writer is something I really admire. I told him that I had been commissioned to write a play for Joseph Papp. And I hear you're working on a project of John Lennon's books. Yes. How marvelous. It must be wonderful to be a writer. The article about you in the Evening Standard said you lived here briefly as a child. I was adopted in the United States, but my adoptive parents moved here. My adoptive mother died soon after we came here, and I was sent back to the United States, where I was raised by a wonderful man, a retired Army officer. He stared into my face as I faltered. Well, I can sense you don't want to talk about it. It's just that my adopted mother died under very strange circumstances, and I am haunted by it. I dream of discovering how she died. And did she die here in London? Yes. We lived in a large, dark old house off Old Brompton Road. Have you been to see it? Not yet. Then we must go there together. Perhaps we can even talk the present tenants into letting us inside so that you can see the rooms again. He smiled and leaned forward and took my hand.
We seemed to have so much in common. We both loved Fellini. We talked about the Italian director for the rest of our lunch. Then he drove me back to Primrose Hill in his yellow Lotus. It promised to be a happy summer. I didn't know that on that very day, someone I didn't know had made a trip to the house on Old Brompton Road. Someone who wanted to know everything there was to know about me. That afternoon, Julia Lanier called. She was an American living in London after her divorce. She had started an off-Broadway theater in New York and planned to produce some projects in London. I hear you're working on a project based on Lennon's books. Can you come to tea today? Adrienne Gill, one of my best friends, who was in the Beatles movies, is coming. He's a director and an actor. I thought perhaps the two of you should meet. Perhaps he can get Lennon interested in the project. The boys and I walked up to Hampstead in the green summer afternoon. Julie Lanier has sons too, I said. When we reached Hampstead, they disappeared off into the enormous, lush backyard. Adrienne Gill turned out to be a terribly funny man who did indeed know John. He took the script I had written to John's house in Weybridge to ask Lennon's permission to show it to producers. Gill said we would all meet in a few weeks. After the lunch on Beauchamp Place, I didn't hear from James for several days, although I did receive in the mail a record from him. The music from La Strada. Then, one evening around 6, just after the boys and I had come from a walk in Primrose Hill, he called.
Suzanne, could you please come to the theater tonight? I must talk to you.
Chapter 3. The Royal Court Theatre looked majestic, surrounded by the square of flowers. James was not backstage, but was sitting on the red carpeted stairs that led to the lounge, where coffee and drinks were served during intermission of the plays. James, what is it?
Suzanne, come sit with me. Here, I'll get you a coffee.
He got up and brought me a small coffee from a silver pot that sat on the table.
Did you get the music from La Strada that I sent you?
He smiled. Oh, yes. I played the music constantly. James, is something wrong? At that moment, someone wandered into the lounge and asked him for his autograph. After he left, James said,
There is something wrong. Can we go out after the theater? I want to talk to you.
Of course. I'll wait for you. He headed for the doorway that led to the dressing rooms, turning just before he disappeared.
You look so beautiful in that purple dress with your violet eyes and dark golden skin.
And as he stood in the doorway, he looked so slender, so blonde, so perfect with his dazzling blue eyes, totally the image of the romantic Englishman. I'll go in and see the performance, I said. The curtain went up on Deadly Triplets. The play had a chilling plot involving death and greed. The playwright, William Weldon, was one of the most admired young playwrights currently on the London scene. His plays were not quite as abstract as Edward Bond's or Pinter's, but not as realistic as John Osborne's. He was very drawn to themes of mixed identity, ambition, and evil in contemporary life. Deadly Triplets was 2 one-act plays under that title. The first was a curtain raiser. The second, Deadly Triplets, was the main play. When I met Victor Hamilton, the head of the Royal Court, he remarked about the affinity between Weldon's work and my own. We used real people as a takeoff for our plays, and being killed for one's identity was a common theme. In Eslin's book, Theater of the Absurd, he gave a page to Weldon. Both these plays were cinematic, with powerful images and many things happening at once. The second play, which took place in a modern version of an Elizabethan castle, went fine. But James did appear agitated and seemed to falter once, as if he were about to fall. For a moment, it seemed that the side of his head was bleeding, but then I realized that it was stage blood that he had accidentally smeared with his hands onto his temples. After the performance, we went to the Daisy, a restaurant on the King's Road in Chelsea that was very popular.
Suzanne, sometimes I believe I may be in danger.
What sort of danger?
A danger that I can't define. Tonight, I was so nervous that I got the blood from my hands all over my face. Sometimes I wonder, is it working with Sarah?
Sarah?
She plays the Queen, Sarah Constable Maxwell. We were once engaged, and after it was over, she wrote me some very anguished and dark letters. Sometimes I can see her watching me from the wings.
Do you think she would harm you?
I don't know. But I was surprised to find she knows a great deal about you.
About me?
Yes. She knows that your adopted mother was a woman called Gina Shearer, your adopted father, a producer. She seems to know a great deal about them and even knows the person who lives in the house on Old Brompton Road. We were standing backstage when all of a sudden she started to talk about you.
I was afraid the article in the Standard had raised questions about me. It made me uneasy. James sensed my fear. He took my hand. We ordered more drinks. The restaurant was pretty, the table round and covered with pale blue linen cloth. In a mood that was to persist when I was with James. People and events became hazy, almost as if I were hypnotized. I was half aware that the movie actor Richard Harris sat at a nearby table with a girl in a white dress. Twiggy came in. Some people were dancing, and Mia Farrow came up and spoke to James for a second. Then we were alone again. James, will you still go to the house on Old Brompton Road with me?
Of course I will. We'll go soon. It seems a theater photographer lives there now. In fact, I think I've met him once or twice. His name is John Sharples.
We talked no more that night of the danger he sensed. But in the intoxicating golden light of the restaurant, I couldn't stop staring at the slight trace of stage blood still on the edge of his blonde hairline. Suddenly he said,
Do you know that woman over there?
I turned.
There's a woman seated against the wall by the door. She's been watching us.
I turned, but she was gone. Sitting in Primrose Hill while the boys fly kites, I work on my list. Tea at playwright John Arden's. We sat in an upstairs parlor, a lovely Sunday. The boys and the Ardens' beautiful children run up and down the stairs. James told me that he heard Weldon is writing a new play, and that Weldon is very secretive about the nature of the play. It will be called Deadly Triplets Again, and it does have a role which both Weldon and Victor Hamilton are hoping James will consider. James says he believes Weldon has shown Hamilton parts of the new play, but of course Hamilton is quite secretive too. They are hoping the play will be the big attraction at the court next year, and have already approached one or two other well-known actors. It seems there is again a role for Marianne Faithfull, who Hamilton used in The Three Sisters. James says he's positive Weldon is showing Hamilton pages of a rough draft as he finishes them, and that he heard the play will further explore historical characters as symbols and create a plot from fact and Weldon's own imagination, just as he had done in Deadly Triplets. There were rumors that Hamilton spoke to Lawrence Harvey about a role. Hamilton loved putting film stars in his plays and had been searching for a play that might possibly star Marianne Faithfull and Mick Jagger.